Fellas, you know Degree Cool Rush deodorant, right? Well, last year they changed the formula, and guys were mad about it. One dude even started a petition. So guess what? Degree heard us, admitted they messed up, and brought the original Cool Rush scent back exactly how it was. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So grab some and remember why its cool, crisp, and fresh scent made it the #1 men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory for all of us.
At Sierra, discover great deals on top brand workout gear, like high-quality walking shoes, which might lead to another discovery.
40,000 steps, baby. Who's on top now, Karen?
You've taken the office step challenge a step too far. Don't worry, though. Sierra also has yoga gear. It might be a good place to find your zen. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
It is Monday, April 28th, 2025. Welcome back to Hang Up and Listen, the sports podcast here at Slate. Back with you yet again. I am Alex Kirshner, a contributing writer for Slate, and I also co-host the college football podcast Split Zone Duo. This week, we have a big show for you. We will talk about the NFL draft and the major slide that Colorado quarterback Shedeur Sanders went through, going all the way from a projected, but maybe never real, we don't know, top 10 pick to getting drafted by the Cleveland Browns in the 5th round. We will mark the first month of the Major League Baseball season with some discussion of spring surprises, which unexpected Aprils were a sign of things to come and which were a mirage. And as Formula One gets set for a race in Miami this week, its first stateside race of the year, we will talk to an expert about the sport's seemingly blunted momentum off the track. As usual, joining me this week is Lindsay Gibbs, the publisher of Power Plays, a newsletter that covers the key stories of the moment in women's sports. Lindsay, how are you?
I am doing great. This is a fun weekend of sports. There is a lot happening right now, so it's been good. The NBA playoffs got fun, and I'm just loving it. Leading into summer, perfect.
Yeah, this is a really underrated sports time of the year where there's just an NHL or an NBA playoff game going on basically at all times. Ben Lindbergh, did you dip your beak in the playoff trough this weekend?
Yeah, it's been quite entertaining, actually. And this is still early enough in the NHL and NBA playoffs that fatigue hasn't set in.
Yeah.
You get to month 2 or whatever it is, and you start thinking to yourself, this is still going, huh? This is still happening. But no, now it's all new and fresh. And so I also had a nice weekend, although I was not caught on camera at a sporting event. Unlike one hang-up host, this is Alex Kirshner as seen on TV.
Oh, I missed this. What happened?
Well, I had an interesting baseball weekend. For one thing, The Ringer's senior editor, Ben Lindbergh, edited a story for me about the extreme ineptitude of the Pittsburgh Pirates, who I've talked about on the show before.
Did they just lose their coach? Did I just get a...
That was the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Oh, I'm sorry. Your other team.
Just parted with their coach.
Which Pittsburgh
It is hard to keep track. But I went to 2 Pirates versus Dodgers games at Dodger Stadium over the weekend with my dad and brother. And on Friday, we actually saw a nice victory for the good guys, 3-0. They played well, clean game. Yeah. On Saturday, they were in it. It was 4-4 in the 8th inning. And then the Pirates brought in this arsonist of a relief pitcher who shouldn't have been in the game. They had better relievers available, but I guess they were saving them for the next day when they lost by 7. And promptly there were 2 home runs hit, one of which was a 3-run shot that landed about 5 feet from me.
Runners go. Kike hammers the ball. Left field and deep. Another Hernandez. Another homer.
And Ben, I could have run over some kids and caught this thing.
Yeah.
I could have done it. I mean, I could have gone Zach Hampel mode.
It would have been great for ratings, Alex, honestly.
Now that I've crossed 30, I don't think I can do that. Am I right about that?
Yeah, no, I think you handled it well, and kudos on the duds. Also, I was zooming in to see what you were wearing. You had the old school getup on, right? If I was looking at the right person. Yeah.
I was wearing my Willie Stargell jersey. Willie Stargell, the last Pittsburgh Pirate to hit 40 home runs. And if you realize how long ago Willie Stargell played, then that might tell you something about the Pittsburgh Pirates. Who knows? Anyway, yes, it was fun until it wasn't. Before we get into our business, as always, we want to thank our Slate Plus members for making this show possible. Subscribing helps us make the show. It allows you to get the show ad-free. That's a fantastic perk. You also get a lot of other stuff from the tremendous podcast network here at Slate. And you get a bonus segment every week from Hang Up and Listen. There's good news. We have one of those live right now for our members. It's about Nottingham Forest, the Cinderella club in English soccer that is really hanging on by a thread to a truly special season. We don't see stories like this in the Premier League often, so we'll talk about it. You can hear that episode right now as long as you are a Slate Plus member. Subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking try free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen.
The NFL has been clueless for 50 years when it comes to evaluating quarterback. Clueless. They have no idea what they're doing in terms of evaluating quarterback. That's proof. There's proof of that.
How many
times say we know exactly what we're talking about with quarterback? They don't.
Poor Mel Kiper. My goodness, the longtime ESPN NFL draft man just was in a bad way over this weekend because he's a true believer in Shedeur Sanders, the former Colorado and Jackson State quarterback. That was one of several outbursts that Kiper gave us over the weekend on the Four Letter Network's sets. This was right after the Browns made Shedeur, Deion's son, the 144th overall pick, which was about 137 picks later. Then Mel Kiper felt strongly that the New Orleans Saints should have taken him. Shedeur was mostly expected, it's fair to say, to be a first-round pick, but there's been a whole body of reporting by NFL journalists in the past few months that says that Sanders was unimpressive in his meetings with teams, coming off like some mixture of entitled and not that serious about what he was doing. Colorado, coached by his dad Deion, treated his pro day sort of like a coronation, like a major marketing event, and the school is even retiring his number soon, which is just wild for a quarterback who was good but certainly not legendary in 2 years there. Donald Trump tweeted about Shedeur's draft plight as it was happening, which I don't think was at all the reason for his fall, but maybe was indicative of something, which is that Shedeur brings quite a media circus, and NFL teams will take that circus if they think a quarterback is really good. But clearly, most teams do not think Shedeur Sanders is. Lindsay, would you tolerate a media storm to make Shedeur Sanders a backup and developmental quarterback for your NFL team? The Carolina Panthers in this case?
My gut reaction is absolutely not, but I really do have complicated feelings about this. Adam Kilgore of the Washington Post wrote that his fall turned from predictable to stunning to sad. And I think that really describes, I went through the gamut of emotions, human emotions, kind of watching this play out over the weekend. I'm kind of mad that the NFL got such good theater for its draft, feel like it doesn't really quite deserve it, but it's tough because the cynic in me gets really frustrated when these teams talk about media circuses and distractions when it's maybe a culture thing or a parental thing. And then, when it comes to violence against women, the guy can be really like a borderline, player getting cut, and they'll still, keep him on the team and take all these chances and go to bat for him. So there's always that element that's playing out as I'm watching this and hearing about how no NFL team will want this media circus or this distraction. I think about all the distractions that they put up with in the past, and honestly, this seems rather tame. But I've got to say, it still sounds a little exhausting to deal with the Shedeur Sanders ecosystem. And I think what's clear is that the Sanders camp, and Shedeur in particular, did not want to go about things the normal way they are done in the NFL when that came to thinking, apparently, rumors have it, his performance in these interviews, not doing throws of the combine, which very elite players can get away with, when it comes to not having an agent, which seems to be kind of a really good intermediate where teams can tell the agent what they're really thinking about a player, whereas teams might not be able, that message might not be getting through to a Deion Sanders type figure. My biggest takeaway was just that the Sanders figured out how to completely warp the collegiate system to be the Deion Sanders, Shedeur Sanders show. And it was very, very effective in a lot of ways. But the NFL is a pretty immovable object. And if you come in and make it clear that you're not willing to play by any of the rules and that you aren't a surefire starter, why would you put up with that?
Yeah, it's like we discussed a couple episodes ago. Teams are often willing to overlook much more serious character concerns than there are about Sanders if they think you can play. But if they're not sure you can play, or if they think you can't, then they're not willing to put up with that much. And it's funny, this draft slide lasted so long that there was time for multiple take rounds. And so when he wasn't taken in the first round, then there was a whole, it's not actually that surprising that he wasn't taken here. Of course, he'll be taken at some point on Friday. And then when he wasn't taken on Friday, and when he slipped past the second round and the third and the fourth and goes to the fifth round, then there was another round of reactions to that, trying to explain, okay, maybe the initial miss of the first round, that has to do with the kind of quarterback he is. But beyond that, that can't explain this alone, that there have to be these ancillary factors, these off-the-field factors that would explain the secondary slide. So I don't want to say there's been revisionist history, but there has been sort of, investigating what we missed or what we underrated, as there should be when there's a surprising result. And so the pre-draft consensus, I know that there were people who thought that he would be a first rounder, even a top half of the first round pick. And that's not just Sanders himself and the Sanders family, but the consensus, it seems, was that he was somewhere between the 20th and 40th best player in the draft class, somewhere on the bubble, the second round bubble. And I guess quarterbacks don't get taken in the second round that much anymore because the good ones go early and then the backups can wait. But he kept falling and falling and falling. And then it culminated in being prank called, at which point you kind of had to feel bad for him, regardless of what your thoughts about him were. And he goes to the Browns, who had passed over him 5 times before they took him. And no wonder, because they now have 5 quarterbacks, which is too many quarterbacks, at least at the start of a season. So it was kind of a combination of things because, there were all these anonymous quotes about him being brash or arrogant and entitled. And often you see that sort of language and you dismiss it as racially coded, often kind of dog whistles. Would you say this about a white player? And the way that he was sort of being presented and compared and contrasted to Cam Ward, who went number 1 overall. There was some of that fell into this pattern of the way that black quarterbacks get talked about. But as Lindsay said, there was also the way that he and his dad approached the draft, which is that they seemed somewhat high on their own supply. They seemed somewhat overconfident about how teams were evaluating them.
I think Deion absolutely did him no favors with just about any of the pre-draft publicity that Dad put out, discussing in public that if Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter, who went number 2 to the Jaguars, who traded up for him, don't like the teams that are on the menu to draft them early in the draft, which presumes, of course, that Shedeur is going to get drafted early, that Deion would work to engineer a situation akin to Eli Manning not playing for the Chargers 2 decades ago, and discussing it as a matter of fact that Shedeur was going to be a top 5 pick. Like, Lindsay, I totally agree with you that it's very off-putting the way that NFL teams will choose what to tolerate and what not to, and that it doesn't abide by any sort of moral code or anything resembling one. But I also just think at some point that you get a reputation for being hard to deal with, and that doesn't work in any workplace, and it extra doesn't work when it's the quarterback position, and where everyone expects that a team will settle on a guy to be the guy. And if you bring in a challenger to that guy, then that destabilizes your relationship with them. I think it's telling that the team that ultimately picked Shedeur Sanders, as Ben mentioned, they got 5 quarterbacks, but none of them are good. Deshaun Watson is a disaster, and so it doesn't upset the apple cart. But there's about 27, 28 NFL teams, maybe 30, that it would upset the apple cart to bring in a guy whose dad's been talking like this and who's been acting like this for the last year.
I think adding to this is the fact that these fairly mediocrely scouted, white quarterbacks got chosen before Shedeur as well. And I watched this draft without following social media like I usually do. Was in the mountains on a little bit of a vacation, so not as glued to my phone as typically am. And so kind of used to the experience of all the draft picks being spoiled before they're announced. And I didn't have that this year. I legitimately didn't know who was being picked until until it was announced. And I mean, there were some really, I just keep saying theatrical, but that's what it was, these moments of, the Giants traded up to get the 25th pick. Is this, we heard that this is going to be a quarterback, and there's a split screen of Shedeur and Dart, and it's Dart, And then you had the moment on Friday where there wasn't the same split screen because I don't think the ESPN cameras were invited in on Friday to the Sanders party, but the Saints were on the board. They were one of the quarterback needy teams, and everyone thinks, okay, it's got to be here at 40, and you're holding your breath. And then the announcement comes, and it's Tyler Shuck, who's 26 or will be 26 soon. Very old for a
AARP
quarterback. Yeah. And, it just kind of kept being, it went from, okay, this is kind of entertaining a little bit, like, I can kind of enjoy this. If he doesn't go in the first round, that's not big. And then it got really cringy when Trump was tweeting, and I was like, oh, geez, do I agree with Trump on something? Like, this has let me rethink everything. But then by the end, he got that prank phone call, and it turned out to be the Falcons defensive coordinator's son called him and said he had been drafted when he hadn't been. And then it's all of a sudden it gets to the point where these teams and quarterbacks have passed on him 4, 5, 6 times. And you're wondering, he might not get drafted at all. And it just became almost a pitiable situation. And I've really never experienced kind of that. That's why I started this all by saying, I'm not really sure how I feel about this. But you know what? The Sanders family has made a lot of content, so I can watch that and figure out how I feel.
Ben, where are you on the 4th or 5th big debate cycle about Shedeur Sanders this week, which is what punishment should be doled out to the defensive coordinator of the Atlanta Falcons who left Shedeur's private draft night cell phone number available on a family iPad? And then his son, unbeknownst to him, according to the Falcons, took that phone number, not only made a prank phone call, but recorded it. Or had it recorded. It's not clear exactly who was making the call. Just clear from the Falcons that the son of the coordinator, Jack's his name, by the way, was involved. Should there be punishment for the Falcons defensive coordinator, or do you think that the shame is enough?
Yeah, I'm not sure. As someone with a young daughter who might conceivably see something someday that I don't want her to and make me look bad, I guess I don't want to come down too harshly. I don't know. It'd be one thing if he had leaked the number to opposing teams or put it out publicly or something. If the call is coming from inside the house, then I don't know. What obligations do you have to safeguard the information from your own family? Just finding something that you left out in the open just because they didn't have the security clearance that you did. I'm not sure, but it's very embarrassing at the least. So maybe that suffices. But that is kind of when it went from maybe becoming, you rubberneck, oh, what is the car crash that's happening here? And maybe it's kind of comical. Maybe even if you felt like he was a bit overrated and got more attention than his skills warranted, there could even be some schadenfreude initially. But then it went from that to sort of sad and just questioning everything. And I think especially because it was this weak quarterback class, as we talked about in our preview last week, it'd be one thing if there were just several franchise QBs in this draft class and he was getting bumped down the draft board because of that. But it was the caliber of the quarterbacks who were being picked ahead of him. Other than Ward's, all of these guys had warts, had question marks, had doubters. And so it wasn't as if there were a bunch of sure things who were vaulting ahead of him. It was, similarly guys who were rated even lower than he had, who had in many cases the same sort of concerns about how their performance would translate to the NFL. So I think that really added to it. And it's funny because the Sanderses don't lack for confidence, obviously, and that can be seen as a plus for a athletic prospect. You want someone who has a bit of an ego, who really believes in themselves, who maybe has a little bit of irrational exuberance and overconfidence about how good they are. That's often seen as a winning trait. And yet, you can take that too far, potentially. And if you treat it as a cinch that you're going to be going early in the first round and you don't really have the underlying skills and tape to back that up, then that becomes a turnoff.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, there are a lot more privilege factors in this conversation than, just the one. It's a very intersectional conversation, not just about race, but it will never be okay with a bunch of white men sitting behind desks talking about how a black man needs to be humbled. Like, that's just never a good analysis, in my opinion. There's got to be something there. I think it's fair to say that the concern, a legit concern, if Shedeur can't see his own shortcomings, is he going to be able to work on them to improve them and put that work in to get where he needs to be, I think is a legitimate concern. And also, but like now he's with the Browns, which the Browns and quarterbacks, just quite the saga we're going on here. Never a dull news cycle when the Browns quarterbacks are around. And that quarterback room is very interesting. And it's worth noting that he was the second quarterback the Browns drafted in this draft. So, is he even going to make the team? I don't know. It's going to be very interesting. But I don't think the Sanders ecosystem is going to slow down at any point here. ESPN had photos of his draft party in Dallas. And on their website, which obviously had to be released, like I'm sure everybody has a draft party, but not all those photos are on ESPN. And, they are continuing to make a lot of content about this and might just get our own 24/7 Hard Knock style. Does Shedeur make the squad? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just stockpile as many quarterbacks as you can. Maybe one of them will be good. It's just quality out of quantity, I guess. But it did kind of become the Shedeur show, and there were a lot of other interesting storylines in this draft, which, that sort of sucked up all the oxygen in the room. But I was kind of fascinated by what happened with the pick directly after Shedeur, his former teammate, Travis Hunter, going with the second pick after the Jaguars traded up. And this was sort of a statement pick, sort of a bold strategy. Cotton, we'll see if it works out for them, where James Gladstone, their rookie GM, this baby-faced guy, just trades up. And I guess the Browns were involved in this too, because that was the Browns pick, and they traded down, and the Jaguars paid a big price to be able to draft Travis Hunter. Just as hyped, more hyped, but more to back up the hype. And of course, Gladstone comes from the Rams, a team that's treated picks as just capital to be spent, essentially. And it seems like they're kind of committed to letting him do his thing. That's what Hunter said. They told me they were going to let me do what I do. After the pick, they had him talk to both of the coordinators. And I thought this was fascinating because usually you'd only see this happen with a quarterback, just trading up that high to make a pick. And the analytical conventional wisdom is that the draft is also random and unpredictable, that you're better off just stockpiling picks and selecting more players. You can't predict the lottery numbers. All you can do is buy more tickets. So this would seem to go against that. But in Hunter, you're potentially drafting two players, or at least that's what you hope. So you are getting both quantity and quality, in theory, at least. And if he were specializing, he'd be the highest drafted quarterback ever in the modern era, and the highest drafted receiver since Calvin Johnson went with the number 2 pick in 2007. But since he's not specializing in the foreseeable future, it's easier to make the case for him as a high first rounder because the upside is obvious. Even the downside provides a fallback plan. Plus, receiver and quarterback are two of the positions that have seen their draft stock rise the most in recent years. And at least for now, he plays both of them. So really started off with kind of the chalk pick in Ward, but then it didn't take long for things to run off the rails in a really entertaining way.
as they tend to do in the NFL draft.
Yeah.
Ben, all I'm thinking about is how the Browns have 5 guys who are going to throw the ball for them, and none of them are good. It gets me into a baseball mood. And up next, we will talk about April.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states and situations.
As we progress through the season, every fan knows that big wins are hard to come by and tough losses are even harder to accept. But do you know what isn't hard to accept? Discover. Believe it or not, Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. You heard that right. 99%. So make a good call for your wallet and get Discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard. The Major League Baseball season is a month old, as most teams started playing on or about March 27th. I marked the anniversary by watching some baseball in person this weekend. Had a great time, at least when things were going my way. It is great to have baseball back, but April baseball, Ben Lindbergh, is a funny thing, because it turns out that they play 162 games in this sport, and there are only about 27 or 28 per team in the first month of the year. In that spirit, I want to talk today about some jolting things that happened in this first month of the season, talk about how transitory or durable we think those things will prove to have been. But first, can you give me the Ben Lindbergh and Effectively Wild podcast read on exactly how much baseball we have to see at the beginning of a season before you can be a little bit less skeptical about the sample size involved in what you're seeing?
Yeah, we used to say that the stats were real when Mike Trout was at the top of the WAR leaderboard. That was a few years ago. That may no longer apply, though he's having an interesting season too. But I do get asked this a lot, and the actual answer is that there isn't really a magic minimum number of plate appearances or a date on the calendar where the stats flip from not real to real. Every game, every day gives you a little more information and just gives you greater confidence. And so the rule of thumb, I guess, is often Memorial Day. That's when you should really pay attention to the standings. I'm not going to say that I don't glance at the standings before that, but we are still very much in the realm of it's early, and probably until the end of May or late in May, that's probably about when you start saying, this is serious. However, we have all this data now, and this very granular data that does allow us to come to some conclusions with greater confidence than we could have in the past. Because when you're looking at all the StatCast data on individual players, you can sort of see changes in skill, and we're not purely reliant on the results the way that we once would have been. And there are things that in small samples actually can be meaningful. Then again, you can drill down on this increasingly detailed data and convince yourself that something is real. And actually, it turns out that no, that was just kind of fluky too, that someone was doing something different, but they couldn't actually sustain that. So it's tough. We're in this era with all of this data at our disposal and playoff odds that are updated throughout the day. So you can see in real time after every win or loss exactly how that affected a team's fortunes. And you're right. It is an extremely long season.
And only about 130 more and change for every team. Ben, we have seen some interesting things so far. I think the most surprising thing, at least to me, in the first month of the season has been the real, rancid play of the Atlanta Braves, a team that most people not only have as a playoff team, but many have as a World Series contender. It's been really bad for the Atlanta Braves. This was, I think, a frontline National League contender coming into the season. And I think is still seen that way because at Fangraphs, where you host the Effectively Wild podcast, the playoff odds for Atlanta are still about 68% as we record this, but they lost their first 7 games. And the dig out is happening, but it's been slow. They're only up to 12 and 15 as we record. Have you, obviously the games count, so those losses count. Are you reasonably confident in a more significant ascendancy for the Braves from here on out, or have you changed how you think about them at all because of how ugly it's been?
Well, I thought it couldn't get worse than last season for them, and they made the playoffs that year, too. They just had an incredible run of injuries, and they still snuck into the playoffs. Granted, it took until the last day of the season, and then they got eliminated quickly. But even to make it there was really a testament to their skill and their depth, given how much talent they lost last year. And you wouldn't have thought that with a lot of those guys getting healthy, or so we thought, that they could start out even worse this year, and yet they have. I do still side with the odds that say, yeah, they'll probably make it back to October. But if you look at the division odds, that is where they have really plummeted, much more so than any other team in baseball, because, of course, they were projected to be in a pretty tight race in the NL East with the Mets, who've been off to an excellent start, and the Phillies. And so you get into a hole like this, it's tough to catch up when you're competing not just against wild card teams for a third wild card spot, but also you're trying to win that division. And their odds have gotten significantly longer of doing that. And granted, we haven't seen them fully healthy yet, and Ronald Acuna's not back yet. Spencer Strider came back, made one start, and went right back on the IL, this time with a leg injury. So I would expect that they will round into form at some point, but I think they were widely perceived as sort of the 1A to the Dodgers 1. And, you know, if they weren't a super team, they were the next closest thing. And they definitely haven't played like that. And their offense from a couple years ago, when it was just a juggernaut, that just has not showed up again. And last year they had an average offense, and you could put that down to injuries. This year it's been sort of the same deal, and it's harder to explain that away.
I was at a cookout 2 weekends ago with an Atlanta Braves fan who was reacting to the news of Ronald Acuna Jr. tweeting about how the manager would have treated him differently than the lousy outfielder Jared Kelenic, who did not get benched after not legging out a ball in play. And this Braves fan expressed exhaustion with Ronald Acuna Jr. and said he's always hurt, and I'd actually be okay if he wasn't on our team anymore. That's not a widely held view, right? Braves fans aren't that far gone, are they?
I would hope not. No, it is certainly true that he has not been as available as he would have liked to be, or as the Braves would have liked him to be, but he is still, when healthy, which we haven't seen yet this season, in theory, at least one of the best players in baseball. And there's no telling, this is multiple knee injuries now, and who knows if his speed will survive the second one. But yeah, until proven otherwise, you're counting on him to come back. And it's been thin in the outfield for them without him.
Also in the theme of really miserable Aprils, and I think this one, according to those playoff odds, is going to be more harmful, is the Baltimore Orioles, who have been like the shining beacon on a hill of prospect development in baseball for the last few years. But I mean, goodness, Ben, they're 10-17. And in this instance, it seems like they are now a really, really long shot to climb through a brutal AL East. Their division chances are basically gone, and they've got a mere 15% playoff shot overall. Almost all of that is wild card. Their pitchers are not healthy. I'm not sure that they're ever going to get good or healthy. Are things as bad in this case as they look?
Yeah, they are pretty bad. I would say this is the more concerning start. And part of this is more predictable because, of course, it was a constant refrain that the Orioles had weak pitching and that they didn't do enough to address their pitching woes over the offseason. And Corbin Burns departed. And maybe no matter what they would have done, he would have left anyway to be closer to home in Arizona. But he even came out and criticized the lack of effort they seemingly made to be aggressive in going after him. And that's kind of been a consistent theme other than trading for Burns in the first place. Mike Elias, their GM, obviously did a great job of drafting and developing this young position player core. And then David Rubenstein, the new owner, comes in and talks a big game about being willing to spend more. And their payroll rose, but not in any exciting way. And they just did not make any splashes this offseason. And Elias has developed a reputation for being what people in baseball call a prospect hugger. He's just very attached to his farm system rankings, to his young, cost-controlled guys. And granted, that's a great way to win in baseball these days, but you then have to take the next step of, okay, we've assembled this excellent core. We're getting tons of production for not much money. We then have to put that money to use and actually go and sign some supplementary players and some stars to fill in the weak points. It's kind of like the Cubs when they won the World Series. They had a very position player-heavy core, but then they went and signed John Lester and they tried to fill in the gaps. And the Orioles just have not done that. And they've depended on a veteran Japanese player who people had doubts about being able to hack it in the big leagues at this point in his career, and Charlie Morton, who's past 40 and looks like he's fallen apart, and other guys who've gotten hurt. And Mike Elias came out and said about Grayson Rodriguez and Zach Eflin, probably the two best starters on the staff, who've both been hurt. He said this was not the plan to have Grayson and Eflin on the shelf simultaneously this quickly into the season. At no point were we forecasting that or expecting that, and that's just the truth. And Mike, I hate to break it to you, but having two pitchers hurt at the same time is not unusual. That is not something that you should not be able to conceive of before the season starts. And especially these two guys who have a history of being injured. Like, you have to build in some redundancy here. And the Orioles just didn't really have the top end talent or the depth. It's as if they expected no one ever to get hurt and it would all just somehow work out. So speaking of Schadenfreude, there's a little bit of it here too, because so many people were sounding the alarm. Hey, Orioles, you got to go get some pitching. And they just didn't do it. And to date, they've had a replacement level starting staff, and they're projected to be the 26th best starting staff the rest of the way, unless they make a major trade, which they could and should do. But it's not even as if you can forecast, oh, okay, they just got to get their guys back the way that we were just saying with Atlanta. There's just not a lot here.
What about what's going on in Minnesota, and is there any hope for this to turn around? Because it looks to be pretty injury related, and that doesn't give me hope, but I am far from an expert. So I'd ask about the Twins in particular, but also if there's any team who has had a tough start who you think, like, it's not time to give up hope on.
Yeah, the Twins, I guess the difference here would be that they're in the AL Central, so it's not the NL East or the AL East. And even though the Tigers are following up their fantastic finish to last season by starting just as strong this year, there's a perception that those teams are beatable. The Guardians, the Tigers, the Royals aren't off to a great start either, that the Twins could make up that ground. But speaking of teams that just were not aggressive enough, the Twins are going on 2 off seasons here, plus a trade deadline of just doing nothing, essentially. And they're in the midst of being shopped around, the franchise, that is. And so it seems like the current ownership just isn't really willing to make major investments now. But it's just sort of sad because they have a strong core there, but also an injury-prone one. And if you know that you have all these guys you're counting on who are good but hurt a lot of the time, then it is even more incumbent on you to get some good backups. And they just didn't do that. They just seemed to bank on everyone somehow staying healthy for the first time. So better competitive situation than the Orioles and the Braves, but probably even less reason to hope that they're going to be way better. Whereas, you know, the Orioles, in both cases, it's just kind of a bummer because these are two teams that are fun to root for and have a lot of compelling players and kind of broke through, but then failed to press their advantage. Like the Twins making it back to the playoffs and then just sort of sitting on their hands since then. And the Orioles just having this great head start on a competitive roster and then not doing what they need to take the next step. So yeah, I wouldn't say that it's a sure thing that they will right the ship because they just haven't done enough.
Thank you for being honest.
There's something to me about teams that are owned by people who are trying to sell them that makes me think it's not going to be a fun few years. I remember the last few years of the Washington Nationals, who didn't wind up selling, at least for now, where the Lerner family just wasn't trying. Yeah. And I think you have to wonder about that with the Twins, who are on the market right now.
And it always seems curious to me because if you want to sell your franchise, it seems like you'd want to maximize the value of that asset. and part of that would be winning and drawing. And Twins attendance has been down dramatically because they haven't really given their fans a reason to come out to the park. And so, yeah, you'd think, trying to maximize my value here, I get, okay, maybe you don't sign Juan Soto or something and, hand that over to your purchasers. But making some sort of effort, I think, would only enhance the appeal of this thing you're trying to sell. So, yeah, I mean, look, there have been some truly horrid starts to the season, and we're seeing the 2025 White Sox give the 2024 White Sox a run for their money. The White Sox started last year. They were 0-3 in March and 6-21 in April, and they really haven't been much better. And the Rockies have been even worse to this point. So it seems as if we're just in a place where we're going to have a team that's challenging for worst record of all time, season in and season out. Maybe that's just a function of the playoff format that we have right now, but those are teams that you wrote off from the start, and the ones that we've been talking about, they at least had higher hopes. And I don't think, to answer your second question, there are that many other teams that I look at right now who are really struggling and think, oh, this is a shocker, or we're not accustomed to seeing them down there. I mean, the Brewers are below 500 slightly, but not that far back of the Cubs, who are off to an excellent start. It's somewhat surprising that the Giants are in first place in the National League West. I think people expected if anyone was going to give the Dodgers a run for their money, and no one was really forecasted to, that it would be the Padres or the Diamondbacks. And that's just looking like an excellent race because other than the 4-23 as we speak Rockies, the four top teams in that division are all clustered within a few games of each other and are all off to strong starts. So that's the nice thing, I guess. There are some quite good races, AL East, NL East, AL Central, even AL West, where you have a few teams that are grouped quite close together. I think even the last place Angels are 3.5 back of the first place Mariners. So it's too early for most teams to have separated themselves.
Has there ever been a division in the divisional era that has the shape of the NL West this year, with obviously the Dodgers and then three more teams that look pretty good?
Yeah.
And then the Colorado Rockies, I'd have to do the math about what they're pacing for, but as we record this, they have a winning percentage of 148.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I've ever seen that before.
Yeah, it's like the math almost doesn't work out. It's like, how is every team in this division so good? Oh, and then you look and see the Rockies at the bottom. It's like, okay, somewhere those intra-division losses, if you're getting all those wins, the losses had to come from somewhere. And that's the Rockies, who are just as rudderless and hopeless and without a plan as any team in baseball.
So in true hang-up fashion, we talked about all the really bad teams. We've gone through, we've focused on despair and angst and sadness. The biggest offseason storylines, though, really were the Mets and the Dodgers, I feel like. The big signings, the big moves, and they seem to be doing well. I haven't been watching a lot. I tune into baseball after March Madness and, after I've caught my breath post March Madness, if that. But have those off-season moves, are these looking like juggernauts? They're towards the top of the standings. Is the big spending paying off?
Yeah, so far so good. The Mets are off to an excellent start, and it's not so much Juan Soto powered as it is their pitching, which has been good. That is somewhat surprising. And also Pete Alonso, the guy who had a hard time drawing interest this offseason, has made everyone look bad for not bidding higher on him thus far. And they've amassed a 4-game lead, which is somewhat substantial at this point in the schedule. The Dodgers, they initially just went on a run to start the season, and it looked like, oh boy, we're heading for historic territory here. And they've come back to the pack a bit. And as I mentioned, the Giants are just slightly ahead of them. The Padres and the Diamondbacks are right there, so it is looking like a dogfight as of now. But they haven't fully clicked and put things together. And of course, they have plenty of injuries in the pitching staff, which, we knew was going to be the case, and they tried to plan for that. But even now, we've got Blake Snell, one of their big offseason signings, is on the IL with shoulder issues, and Tyler Glasnow has had issues of his own, and Shohei Ohtani's pitching timeline has been pushed back a bit, so he's still probably at least a couple months away from taking the mound. So somehow, no matter how many pitchers the Dodgers sign, they still find themselves with a three-man rotation in the end. But that no one's worried about them. It's just a question of, are they going to absolutely blow everyone away and lap the league and run away with this thing, or is it going to be more competitive? And thus far, it's been more competitive. And the other big coastal behemoth and big spender, the Yankees, are also in first place and off to a strong start. And that was very much in doubt, as we talked about on this show, after their spring injuries and Garrett Cole being gone, and where was the pitching going to come from. And even though some of their additions have not panned out and their new closer, Devin Williams, has been bad for them, they're still getting great work out of Max Fried, their big signing on the pitching side this offseason. And Aaron Judge is just an unstoppable force. And, we've hyped Shohei Ohtani as much as anyone, and I've hyped Shohei Ohtani as much as anyone over the past 5 seasons, and with good reason. I'm not suggesting that we hype him less, but I am suggesting that maybe the guy who is second in hype over that time, Aaron Judge, should have been a closer second, because even though he's done it differently than Ohtani has, he has net been equally valuable to Ohtani over the past 5 seasons, as Ohtani has won 3 unanimous MVP awards. Of course, Judge has a couple of his own. But if anything, we're not appreciating just what an unstoppable force he is.
Ben, we have to say it while we can, because it might not be true tomorrow, but his on-base percentage is 500 as we sit here and record this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's April 28th. It's 500.
It's otherworldly numbers, and he's batting over 400 in a time when the league is batting 240, and he's slugging 700. And with anyone else, you'd say, oh, he can't keep that up, but he slugged 700 last year. It's a few years ago when he hit the 62 home runs, and there was the record chase and all the attention around that. He's actually been better since then. Last year, he was better on balance on a rate basis, and this year he's been better than that. And last year, the only thing holding him back from a truly all-time season was a slow start, where he was basically an average-ish hitter, which is a slump by Aaron Judge standards at the start of the season. And this year, he's coming out of the gate with a 250 or so WRC plus, which would basically be Bondsian, Ruthian over a full season. And with anyone else, you'd say hot start, can't sustain it. But Aaron Judge, it's just, this is his true talent level at this point. And he just turned 33. I don't know how long that will be the case, but we should appreciate that we are seeing the best offensive player really since Bonds, and at least so far without the baggage that Bonds had.
Lindsay, the moment of truth. It's been about a month of the season. Do you have a favorite horse to back the rest of the way while we wait for Charlotte to get an expansion franchise, or Raleigh?
Look, this is a big decision. I take it really seriously. And also, there are so many baseball games to follow. So I when I make a commitment, I want it to be right. So I want to say that I'm going to do a trial run. And the reason this has to be a trial is because this is a West Coast team. And that makes me nervous because I like to sleep. But, look, the Hang Up fans spoke. And Ryan DeBusk, particular, his Padres pitch was very good. I was worried that it was too good of a team. I don't want to jump on a bandwagon. My heart goes with the downtrodden. But he did point out that the Padres are one of 5 franchises to never win a World Series, last appearing in a World Series in 98. And media market size, San Diego ranks around 25th. And so that makes me feel better about my allegiance. And also, like we've mentioned, they're in a very close divisional race. So, really anything could happen. But the most important was that he alerted me to a meme account. And if I can't watch the games, I can at least follow the memes. And that gives me hope that this will be a good relationship. But I'm going to give myself to Memorial Day to make it official. But we're starting a trial run with the Padres.
Yeah, a lot of fun players on that team, a lot of reasons to root for them, and going by the underlying numbers, at least, they have been the best non-Mets team in the National League, so they're off to a strong start.
Up next, Formula One's business isn't exactly going vroom, vroom, vroom right now. We'll talk about it. As we progress through the season, every fan knows that big wins are hard to come by and tough losses are even harder to accept. But do you know what isn't hard to accept? Discover. Believe it or not, Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. You heard that right. 99%. So make a good call for your wallet and get Discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard.
24 chefs, 24 culinary showdowns for 24 hours straight. Which chef will outcook, outpace, outlast the competition?
No chef
Escapes the clock. All new 24 and 24 Last Chef Standing, Sunday night at 8. See it first on Food Network. Stream next day on Max.
There are people out there all across the country pushing boundaries to grow the game of golf. Like champion speed golfer Lauren Cupp, who plays faster than anyone else. And Will Lowry, whose work in the golf community inspires more kids to get into the game. As a champion partner of the Masters, Bank of America supports everyone determined to find out what's possible. In golf and in life. What would you like the power to do? Bank of America. Bank of America N.A. member FDIC, copyright 2025, Bank of America Corporation, all rights reserved.
Formula One comes to Miami this weekend. Its first American race of the year. There are 3 now. A couple years ago, there were just 1. This one started in 2022, and it is a glitzy monument to sports and capitalism and South Floridian excess and all the works. And the F1 boom of the early 2020s, which birthed this race, really, was a huge sports business story. And Lord knows there is not an outlet on the internet, Slate and me included, that has not covered it at length. Netflix debuted a glossy propaganda docuseries that followed a lot of the circuit's drama starting in 2019. A lot of us watched it during COVID. Many more of us started to tune in during that great 2021 season that had the iconic championship race between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. And F1's ratings did go up a ton that year, but they've been steady and generally declining since peaking the next year in 2022. Liberty Media, which owns F1, the 10 teams are independently held, has been shopping its U.S. media rights for next season and beyond, reportedly looking for at least $150 million a year in exchange. It hasn't found a taker yet, not even ESPN, its current partner. Our latest guest goes by the pen name The Entertainment Strategy Guy, and he published a pretty bearish case for F1's media business last week on his newsletter on Substack. You have perhaps seen his work around the web and the podcast sphere before. ESG, do you mean to tell me that not only are F1's ratings not very good right now and its media rights not a very hot property, but in fact the big ratings boom from 2021 might have largely been the result of a change to how Nielsen calculated viewership? Is F1 a sinking ship?
I wouldn't call F1 a sinking ship. I would say it's more a steady ship. One of the things I try and pride myself is instead of putting out, hot takes, I like put out a ton, but I try and do every so often put on the entertainment nuance guy hat or moderate take hat. So aggressively like moderate is what I like to say. And when it comes to F1, the ratings increase, I think, is legitimate. It definitely saw that boom. All those factors you mentioned definitely played a role, especially from the 2010s and moving into the 2020s. But the factors I think that drove the viewership boom the most was actually one when Liberty bought the Formula One in the first place, because they supercharged a lot of the PR efforts and the marketing across the world. And more importantly, when ESPN bought the rights, because ESPN in a lot of ways is the home of sports, and they have a lot of network effects that can drive viewership for previously obscure sports and help them out significantly. If you add on top of that, Nielsen changing how they do the measurements, which for the audience who doesn't know, previously Nielsen had only focused on viewership that went inside the home. So that meant that if you were watching, like say, imagine you're at a local sports bar and there's all these TVs on the wall on a Saturday, all watching college football. In the previous version of Nielsen, none of that viewership was captured in their ratings. Similarly, if you went over to a friend's house to watch the, say, NFL championship weekend game, that rating was also not included in the viewership. That changed starting in before the 2021 season, and then has actually constantly been expanding to more territories. So that's why viewership for a lot of sports ratings are up prior to the previous period. So we saw this increase in Formula One ratings going from about 600,000 viewers per race up to 900,000. And then it peaked 2 years ago about 1.2 million. And the last 2 seasons, it's been down about 1.1 million. So I've seen some headlines calling Formula One a fast growing sport. And my nuanced take is it was growing and now it's a stable sport.
To what do you attribute the perception that this was a Netflix boost? Obviously, we know that there is such a thing as a Netflix phenomenon. Netflix acquires a show. It's not guaranteed, but in some cases that can boost it to a new level of prominence. Is it sort of a after, therefore, because fallacy in the sense that the appearance of Drive to Survive on Netflix was the most salient change for a lot of people who weren't paying close attention? And so they figured, okay, the sport got more popular. Netflix put out a show. Therefore, it must be more popular because Netflix put out a show. Or is it sort of a bubble media ecosystem, people reading tweets from other people who got into Drive to Survive and just assumed that that must have been the whole explanation?
Absolutely. And to be clear, I don't think Drive to Survive had nothing to do with the phenomenon. It absolutely introduced the sport to millions of new people who then likely start watching some episodes if it's on ESPN and they happen to see it on. I don't think it created as many people, and then I think it worked in tandem with ESPN. So people watched parts of Drive to Survive, and then they saw it on ESPN and they watched it. Whereas previously, if Drive to Survive had happened and the ratings were still on the now defunct NBC Sports Network, I don't think we would have seen the same boost because not as many people would have watched it. But to answer your question, yes, I think the reason it drove it was because it was such a good narrative. And there was a lot of people invested in selling that narrative as well. Netflix actually always does well when it comes to matters of the press. And a lot of people are huge Netflix fans and users. So putting out that connection just made a terrific amount of sense versus talking in kind of a more wonky traditional story that, hey, ESPN bought the rights and then Nielsen changed how they measure. And at this point, half the audience is like, oh, that's a boring story. Oh, Netflix, Drive to Survive. It's just a much better story. And again, I think all three things contributed together to boost the rise. But the one thing I point to a lot of times is that Drive to Survive, when it does come out, is actually not that popular of a TV show. Especially in America. Most often it doesn't debut in the top 10 of the Nielsen ratings, which means in any given week, it's never the top 10 most popular show. Now, a lot of documentaries do have longer lifespans. Netflix's algorithm can surface it. But even in the global ratings, it hasn't really been growing in its viewership either. So it gets a lot of credit and it helps spark the sports docuseries boom, most of which haven't revived the fortunes for their parent sports.
It's very interesting to me that the rights haven't been bought yet, that they're just kind of hanging out there at this price. Do you think they're going to have to come down with the ask? Like, where do you think this is going?
When I wrote about this in my most recent article, I lead with the Jerry Maguire quote, "Show me the money."
Yeah.
When in doubt, follow the money. And in this case, if your sport was showing signs of huge growth, people would be trying to lock in a lower price and be able to ride that growth going forward. F1 clearly has floated these numbers out there. They haven't been able to ride that growth. So I think other people who are the other media buyers are seeing the ratings sort of flatline. And I think they're worried as well is that especially if you're not ESPN and I'd say maybe Netflix, because their first forays into certain sports have actually done very well with some caveats, they're worried that you'd be paying to try and get those same amount of ratings and not get them. As for what F1 can do, whenever a league doesn't quite hit their revenue targets, there's a lot of things they could do, ranging from just not releasing how much their rights deal got, or modifying the terms so that they can have, say, a higher, ostensible deal, but have an earlier opt-out clause. So then that way, if they are succeeding, they can opt out early, or the network that has the rights can opt out. Like I said, I think right now across the sports media system, there's been some waiting to see if sports prices were actually going to decrease at any point. Now, this obviously didn't happen, and I'm only talking for America here. The global picture is also something different with Formula One, because there it is in many countries, much, much more popular than it is here in America. But with the NFL, they were always going to get their big, huge increase, and we had eyes on the NBA. They obviously secured a big headline increase. My calculations are about 10% increase year over year, but they drove about half of that value by selling extra national games, which was a story that wasn't really publicly reported very much. Since then, we've actually seen a number of partners step back from national media rights deals or let them go to market. So during the NBA negotiation, the big news was that Warner Brothers Discovery didn't lock up their deal during their exclusive negotiating period. And then they got a ton of negative press for doing this. But since then, we've seen ESPN actually let deals with MLB, UFC, and Formula One all go to the national press. And I think that's partly because ESPN doesn't want to pay as much as a lot of those networks or a lot of those sports leagues are looking for.
ESG, you talk about one thing in your story that I got to admit had me looking at myself a little bit askance, which is not the Netflix factor per se, but I'll call it the digital media factor. A lot of people like the three of us in our, not only in our industry, but I think our type of people, like, relatively online, new media, Netflix subscribing type people who watched the show and then really enjoyed sort of the peak of F1 entertainment a couple years back. And what did we do? Well, many of us, just speaking for me here, wrote a lot of stories about it. I've written a handful of F1 stories. I've done a long interview with Martin Brundle at GQ. I've written for Motorsport. I've done stuff here at Slate. And I think that frequency of published work matter about F1 and certainly tweeting and blue skying about it seems like it's a little bit out of step with how few people seem to actually be watching it nationally. Did we create a bubble for ourselves here in terms of just how big this thing was?
Yeah.
Is?
I mean, yes, I think so. I think there's certain sports, certain TV shows and movies, I think this absolutely happens, where they do perform better in the so-called, say, conversation that overlaps the articles that go to the social media websites that then feed people back to the articles. And that can be a self-reinforcing bubble. I actually do think Formula One over-indexes on, say, people who are on social media sites like Twitter and Blue Sky. I think it over-indexes with a lot of journalists, and then that probably has an overlap with the Netflix audience as well. And so that can be a self-reinforcing bubble. And you get a lot of news articles that serve that audience. A good example that I think happened in real life on this was the show Mad Men back in the day. Mad Men's viewership it's kind of like the F1 viewership of the world. Its ratings were, I don't want to quote them off the top of my head, but it's something like 1 million viewers per episode were watching it live. And this was at a time when, broadcast was still getting 10 million. But the articles written about Mad Men the next day would be the most read things on a website's coverage. So Mad Men was getting tons of recaps.
Sounds like Severance.
Yeah, Severance.
Yeah. Succession.
Succession had it, and then actually somehow Succession managed to drive into an actual significant viewership increase. But absolutely with Severance, like if you are a media executive or entertainment professional, you were like watching Succession, right? And I think the key is those are a lot of people who the Monday morning are at their computer in their office or at home, now, and scrolling internets for things to read, right? If your job doesn't enable that, you're less into the Mad Men Succession conversation. So I think Formula One benefited from that. And that's why the amount of coverage compared to something like even say the NFL or college football, right? If you look at the ratings again for the average weekend, and again, it's early morning, but, just random ESPN SEC games are outrating, a lot of these Formula One races. And there's, dozens of college football games all weekend.
Yeah, and you bring data to these discussions, which I appreciate. And a lot of people still think, oh, it's streaming. We have no idea. It's a black box. But of course, the premise of your work is that actually we can glean some insights here. And you've written a lot about F1 specifically, but you've also written a lot about the trend towards sports documentaries, as you alluded to earlier, and ratings deals for sports leagues, and kind of punctured the sacred cows at times and tried to let some air out of the hype here. And I guess it's because we look at the NFL and it's such a juggernaut and it's incomparable. And so broadcast networks are trying to snap up all sorts of rights, and sometimes that makes sense and sometimes not. Or we see a Last Dance style phenomenon and think, oh, there's a opportunity here, and everyone, copycat industry, as they say, and everyone wants to make those. And as you noted, in many cases, they just don't really resonate. And you've documented this with some athletes who've gone into business and fund and make these things, and big name stars, LeBron James, etc. And in many cases, these things just sort of land with a thud. And I guess Drive to Survive and F1 is kind of at the nexus of these trends, because we're talking about a documentary and we're also talking about ratings. So would you say that on the whole, it's healthy when it comes to sports ratings and media rights, and then documentaries? Is this a dying, just overinvested in genre?
I think overinvested in is the best way to describe sports documentaries. Sports documentaries have always been a part of the landscape. I think that sometimes gets lost in the coverage with the so-called boom in sports. ESPN was making sports documentaries, like 30 for 30 was a thing. There were also specific programs about specific sports over the years. I think two things changed. One is, I think in a lot of cases, the athletes themselves have gotten even richer because the growth in media rights really has flowed down to a lot of athletes, so that they really do have, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars they can put to build a business. And it's much more fun and sounds cooler to build a sports media business than just, invest in the S&P 500 and have a well-diversified portfolio, right? The problem is you had a lot of that investment coming, and then a lot of it collided with the streaming bubble, and that a lot of people also wanted to invest in production to feed all the content companies. And that bubble burst around 2021, 2022, as a lot of the valuations for all the companies came down. So a lot of people investing in the producers who are going to feed this came back. It's also very cool to invest with someone like LeBron James. If I were a private equity guy, right, and you're going around, you could go make a deal with like a steel factory somewhere, or you could go invest and have a meeting with LeBron James and Steph Curry and Kevin Durant. And I know who I would like. Well, we got to take that meeting, guys. This is going to be great, right? And so I think some of that inflated it in addition to the push for content. But then, like TV always does, when the ratings come out, these things don't perform up to that level. I think it's also in a lot of cases just going to be very much a dialing back in the prices that are paid for the content, because a lot of these are very good shows. They're very solid, like singles and doubles. The problem is if you're paying tens of millions of dollars per episode in some of these cases, and some of these shows, I've heard crazy figures for the budgets, then when they don't perform, that's when you have the problem. I think there's still good investments. The other one is, I think the leagues have realized that one show on Netflix will not save your league. So we saw that in particular with golf and their show Full Swing, saw it with tennis as well, that had these documentaries on Netflix. We even saw it with NBA's Starting Five, which didn't make the top 10. Again, they're still good to make these shows and try and get viewers. The question is, what are the streamers actually paying for them, and how much are they actually being produced for? And I think it'll get right-sized over time.
My area of expertise is women's sports, so I was thrilled to read in your newsletter the takedown of this much touted and much hyped WNBA media rights deal that was announced, I think earlier this year or last year, I don't know. But, it got a lot of praise, but you break down that this deal is not good, which I have been saying. Can you explain how the numbers and how looking at this F1 asking price really shines a light on what the WNBA did wrong here?
Yeah, the WNBA seems, and again, I'm not an expert in the WNBA media rights, but one of the things I've been banging on against is I tend to be skeptical of any new trend that goes out there. And so when Caitlin Clark-Rise was starting, I was always like, let's see. I want to give it like a year to check the data. And I think the data is in on the Caitlin Clark effect. And I think she has lifted a lot of boats in that she has driven specific increases in both women's college basketball and the WNBA now, along with a new crop of stars that are coming up. I think like Angel Reese, I think Paige Buchers is like going to continue this. And we saw that while the college Final Fours ratings were down, they're also significantly up compared to past years. Yeah. That's sort of what a superstar effect can do. We saw the same thing like with the Michael Jordan. So that brings us to the WNBA deal. It looks like it was negotiated around the same time as the NBA deal, specifically the one that got announced with the 3 same partners for the same time period of 11 years, which is what the NBA's deal is. And I actually think that's a better context than the Formula One, in that if I'm looking at the math correctly, the entire WNBA deal is worth what I think for the whole 11-year span is what Disney is going to pay on average for the NBA every year, which the viewership has definitely gotten closer between those two sports, between the WNBA. And so to put that in context, the WNBA is getting $200 million is a reported number for those 3 partners for 105 regular season games and 20 playoff games across Disney, NBC Universal, and Prime Video. And the F1 ratings is seeking 150 to 180 million for 24 races per year. So even though the WNBA definitely has a lot more inventory, but on ESPN, they're actually averaging about the same amount of ratings as Formula One gets, though it is in more primetime hours. So the worry I have or would have if I were a WNBA fan or the players is that if their sport keeps seeing growth at the same time that someone like F1 is seeing growth decline, that $200 million deal is going to look like just an absolute steal in like 5 years. It's also a very long deal. So for a growing sport, you would actually want shorter deals, where if you're a sport where you're worried about the media rights, potentially like the NBA, an 11-year deal makes a lot more sense.
He's the entertainment strategy guy. You can find his newsletter on Substack. You can find him on a whole bunch of podcasts where he is a regular. ESG, thanks for joining Hang Up and Listen. It's great to have you on.
Great. Thanks for having me.
That's all for this episode. We also have a special bonus show that is live right now in the podcast feeds for our treasured Slate Plus subscribers. It is about Nottingham Forest and a dream season on the brink in the English Premier League. To hear that, you can subscribe to Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or you can visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen. That episode is available right now, and we look forward to seeing you over there. Our show notes are at slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to follow the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. For Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs, I'm Alex Kirshner. Remember Zelma Beatty, and thanks for listening.